Hello, and welcome to another episode of Undiscovered Beasts and Strange Phenomena. Please join our experienced and knowledgeable panel of hosts as we explore the great mysteries of our time: Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts, and unexplained phenomena.
Hello, and welcome to Undiscovered Beasts and Strange Phenomena with Adam Davies. Tonight we have a very special show lined up for our listeners, a show I've waited to have with Adam here for quite some time. Many of you may be aware that Adam has had many travels to the continent of Asia in search for evidence for the existence of the Yeti, the Yeren, Almasty, Mande-Burung, and Orang-Pendek, among others. They will be covering, we will cover many topics this evening as we discuss these cryptids from the great continent of Asia. Legends have persisted for centuries across many cultures from one end of the continent to the other. Perhaps no one person has spent more time in the field in more different places in Asia, interviewing eyewitnesses and gathering possible evidence of these fabled creatures. From the roof of the world to the deepest jungles, Adam has been there investigating these man-beasts. I'm very privileged and honored this evening to welcome in my esteemed colleague and co-host, Mr. Adam Davies. Hello, Adam. How are you this evening?
I'm very well, thank you, Mike. Thanks. It'll be a lot of fun doing this show. There's lots of questions I know you want to ask me, so I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I'm certainly fired up about it myself. I'm a little under the weather. You'll have to forgive me if I cough on occasion. Trying to fight through it, but it's all good. Well, Adam, I wanted to start off tonight about talking about the continent of Asia a little bit itself. You've been there several times, and I know you have a really good feel for it. Now, somebody like me that's never been to Asia, I really don't know, other than, what I can research about it. From having a lack of first-hand experience myself, I would definitely, look to you and others that have been there for a little bit of insight. And, of course, you and I, we share a great passion for cryptozoology. And these man-beasts of Asia have persisted for centuries. And one thing about it, and to try to put this in the correct context, if you will, can you speak a little bit just to the enormity of Asia itself and the diversity of different environments and possible habitats across the continent?
Yeah, I can. I mean, obviously, you stretch all the way from the edges of Europe right the way across the vast tundras of Russia, and all the way down to jungles, darkest jungles like in Sumatra and Indonesia, subcontinents like India. It's vast. And the notion that all of these places are full of people is also erroneous. Many parts of Asia have very few people in. For example, the Mongolian steppes and Nepal. 70% of that country is hardly, if ever, traversed. So what you have is vast ranges of rainforest, plains, jungle, you name it, all across Asia, some of which are sparsely populated or not populated at all. Now, if you combine that with the notion of these creatures, I think there's an important starting point. As well as the habitat, what about the creatures themselves? What about the hominids? What about these man-beasts? Now, for most of our evolutionary history, we have not been alone in existence as a type of man. Many other types have coexisted alongside us. We used to think there was maybe just Neanderthal and maybe a couple of others. With the expansion of the rapid expansion of science in the last few years, we now know there's many others. Not just Flores, which was a starting point, but Davies, all the others, the deer people. I'm not going to give a massive list, but there's many species that coexisted with us at the same time as we existed. So the notion of these man-beasts starts with a very, very big and important scientific possibility, which is this. All I'm saying really is that in remote parts of the world, and sometimes not so remote, but generally in remote parts of the world, in places which are sparsely populated, some of the humans who have coexisted with us could still exist. In fact, they may well exist, and it's our job to find evidence of them, scientific evidence, before they die out. And that's the proposition, and there's nothing remotely incredible about that. In fact, it's actually a very lucid proposition. The idea comes next is how do we gather that evidence? And what I did over all these years of investigation, mostly on my own time and own money, sometimes making films, is look for evidence of these, look for scientific evidence that could be analysed independently by credible scientific bodies and get some sort of corroboration for that evidence. So that's what I've been about.
Well, certainly our field, if you will, is very much evidence-driven. And when it comes to Asia, I guess probably the most infamous, if you will, of these man-beasts would no doubt be the abominable snowman, or Yeti. Tell me a little bit about the Yeti. We've all seen it, the TV shows and the cartoons and all this kind of stuff. What that's like the TV image, if you will, of what we've been programmed to understand a Yeti is. But tell me in your own words, how would you define a Yeti?
Well, let's start with what it looks like, because first of all, and because there's a common misapprehension, there's a few misapprehensions about the Yeti. So, with your permission, Mike, I'll break down a few of the myths, and then we'll go into some possible substantial things. Okay, first of all, it's not white. Okay, you often see these cartoon Yetis which are white. Secondly, well, what could it be? Now, what's important to know is my first degree was in history. Before I did law, my first degree was in history. And if you examine the ancient texts, the ancient Tibetan texts, which I should say predate Christianity or any of the other religions that we're familiar with today, they talk about all the known species in places like Nepal. And what they also do is mention a Yeti as a distinct species. But there are possibly at least 2 or even 3 species of Yeti. One, for example, is described as being a bear, and a bear-like creature, and that's important for any later discussions. But one very clearly is described as being a man, like a bipedal creature, a creature that walks like a man. And there's a very clear distinction between the two. But what you do have, and it's important, is that you have evidence of these creatures existing in these texts for many thousands of years. And I just make a tangential point. My research has also seen evidence, historic records of the Sumatrans describing their own creature many thousands of years. 600 BC, China, they describe the Yerun. And I could go on, but my point about this is, before we focus back on the Yeti, because I think it's an important one I want to make, is that some of these cultures could possibly, there is no possible way they could have had any connection, and yet they are describing having hominids living at the time of the writer, describing them as very real creatures, and I think that's very significant. Yeah, it's long before the notion of plastic Yetis or Bigfoot cartoons. These texts are thousands of years old in some cases. So that's the first point. Now, if we focus in on the Yeti, as I said, it's not white. It's a dark creature. In terms of physical description, when I speak to eyewitnesses, they often, the classic way that they describe it, if you like, is that they describe a creature that's large, but say not as large as a North American Bigfoot. Roughly speaking, about 6 foot tall, covered in light brown or dark hair, often with a conical head, and the most recent eyewitnesses I've come across have described how it was making, as it moved along, a high-pitched whistling sound, which I found quite interesting. But when they describe its movements, they often say, well, it moves much more rapidly than a person ever could. Yeah, so it looks like a man in terms of its physical walking, in terms of the way its gait, almost like a man, but it moves much quicker than they could, and also often at very high altitude.
Yes, very high altitude. So basically what you just did is destroy my childhood image of what I thought a Yeti was. But that's okay.
Well, I'm sorry. I mean, in terms of the altitude as well, I mean, because you raised a point there, what people have to remember is footprints have been found, and the Shipton ones, the classic ones, at very high altitude, very, very high altitude, that only mountaineers go to. And I've been up some of these mountains in the Himalayas, most recently for Josh Gates's Travel Channel show, Expedition Unknown. I did that. But before that, on Monster Quest, I did Abominable Snowman, a two-parter there, and some of that one involved some pretty hardcore mountaineering, the Abominable Snowman episode, which people can Google for free. And on both of those occasions, but what you have to remember is that when you go above the snow line, it's not going to live in the snow line, because what's it going to eat? Yeah, it will walk across these pathways and ridges to traverse maybe from one valley to another, but it's likely to live at a lower altitude, mainly below sort of 13,000, 14,000 feet, around there where the vegetation is still, up to maybe 8,500 feet. If I had to speculate, mountain gorillas, say in Rwanda and places like that, they will operate in around 8,500 to 10,000 feet. I think the Yeti operates higher. But what you also see, to add to that point, is the real contrast between vegetation, flora and fauna that is there before where man is and where it isn't, where man isn't. So let me give you an example which make that statement clearer. So when I did the Monster Quest show, as you walk through the villages, obviously you can see the fact that there's farming and other things. Yeah, and you can see the vegetation commensurate with man. But once you get past that, you see a whole different, in the areas where man has stopped and you're on your own, you see a whole different flora and fauna, and it's for many, many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. So, for example, when I was camped in a remote area at the end of that show, the Monster Quest show, a clouded leopard came into camp, just meow, 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 you know, which was amazing. And the whole place was vibrant and alive. So what you have in Nepal is a very rare, probably this is speculation on my part, a very rare, very solitary creature with a vast range of habitat, which is an opportunistic feeder. So it will feed on seasonal fruits and berries. There's lots of small rodents there it can eat. There's plenty of food for it. Yeah, the idea that people often think that people's notion of the Yeti existing is often built on ignorance, I find, if they're skeptical about it, in the sense that, it couldn't possibly exist. I don't mind people disagreeing with me, but the notion that it couldn't possibly exist is just wrong. There's enough of an ecosystem, there's enough space, there's enough potential through all of the ecosystem and all of the environment for it to still exist, as it no doubt did exist in the past. The question is it still existing now? That's the question, not could it exist. That's just built on ignorance, and there's a big difference.
Well, Adam, do you feel that the reputation, if you will, of the Yeti had been tarnished somewhat over the years by these types of things like goatskin caps and whatnot, finger bones, misunderstandings, and there's certainly quite a history there. Do you think that there's been some reason for outsiders, outside the cryptozoology community, that is, to believe that there was some foul play or things had been misrepresented in a way that might have tarnished the image of the Yeti and maybe added to some discredibility there?
Yes and no. Well, let me explain what I mean by yes and no. Let's start with yes. in the sense that if a skull cap, which is reported to be from a yeti, is found in a monastery and it's analysed to be a goat skin, or if there's a bones, alleged yeti bones, and they're found not to be, then of course it doesn't help matters in any way, because people go, oh, here we go again. Absolutely. So that doesn't help, and it's important that you consider that evidence. If you're going to do any analysis, you have to consider the impact of that evidence and what that might mean for your own investigation. So yes. No, in the sense that some of the assumptions are built on ignorance, and I made the distinction at the start of this, the important distinction about there being different types of yeti, and that its physical description isn't consistent with what's shown in the media, is because the media's got it wrong. I mean, there was a lot of stories about Brian Sykes' research disproving the fact that there was a yeti, because he talked about the fact that the samples that he analysed, some of them might contain some ancient bear species. But that, in fact, was entirely consistent with the historical accounts. If you remember, I talked to you about just 10 minutes ago, which described an ancient bear-type yeti, which was aggressive,
yes,
and also a lamb. Yeah, in fact, it does something to affirm them, because the ancient texts are showing the distinction. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yes, I do.
The third thing is, when I did the first show with Monster Quest, I went to the western side of Sumatra at their behest. And I was a little bit discouraged because I didn't get a lot of recent sightings of the yeti. And a lot of them were from older people, and I was worried it was going to be one of those situations where it may be dying out. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But when I did the Josh Gates show, the producers contacted me before the show started, and they asked me where I'd like to go. And I decided I wanted to go east into an area where there's been a concentration of sightings. And I did pick up some recent sightings, a couple of which I thought were particularly credible, and I was encouraged by that. I really was. It's so much so I'd definitely go back and do that again, and it's just like in a different way, slightly. But I would go back and do that again. So I think that, yes, it's still around and it's still active. It's extremely hard to find because it's so solitary and it's in such remote areas. But I found what I considered probably to be a yeti print while I was there in a particular area, which, without going into too much detail here, suggested a migratory pattern. So I was encouraged. So we haven't got any tangible scientific evidence that's going to persuade people in the scientific community to definitively say the yeti exists. And that's important to state. You know, that always has to be my starting point if you're asking me about scientific evidence. But we have some interesting circumstantial evidence which has encouraged me and which would seek me to want to go and look again. The first time I went, I was a little bit discouraged, and when I was asked to do the second Josh Gates show, I was, I'm going to take a risk and just go to a completely different area. And it paid off. It paid off, and I was glad that they pretty much let me do what I wanted to do, because I did find some interesting evidence there. And there are countries, you know, I've not been to that I'd love to go to, like Bhutan, and really explore, but because I just can't afford it unless I get backing. But that would be something that would be my dream. And I think it could have a good crack at tracking it, but you never know. We'll see.
Well, yes, we can only speculate without hard evidence, but certainly there's a compelling case for the Yeti. And as you mentioned, we're talking about something that's spanned centuries, even millennia. So it's embedded deeply in the culture. There's a lot of interesting circumstantial things, but we don't have that smoking gun. And like you say, that our time may be running out, so to speak, on that. I don't think we're looking at a Yeti population explosion anytime soon or anything like that.
No.
So timeliness is relevant here. I'm going to change gears on you a little bit, Adam, and go to nearby China. Talk to me a little bit about the Chinese wild man known as the Yeren. Is this an animal that is much like the Yeti?
It is and it isn't. I mean, let me cut back to explain how I started to look for the Yeren, because I think people probably would find that interesting. So I'd done a show for Monster Quest, the History Channel, called The Real Hobbit, which was about the Orang-Pendek in Sumatra, and I know we'll probably come on to that later. But they said to me, we really liked what you did. And I said, great. Well, I have this idea for doing this other show in China about the Yeren, and there'd been a recent potential eyewitness report. Because I was fascinated, again, one of the things that I liked about the Yeren and looking for the Yeren was the fact that, as I mentioned to you earlier on, it had that historical pedigree, which fascinated me. And any of your readers can look up, and it's in my book as well, my second book, the Man-Beast book. You can see the notion, the idea that these paintings in Hubei province in central China go back to 600 BC, so very ancient, describing a hairy man, a man which was hairy, which lived in that remote part of China, that then remote part of China. And, so I was very keen to investigate that. I was very, very keen to investigate the stories about that. And because of that historical pedigree. And so I went with Jeff Meldrum. That was the first time I met Jeff Meldrum. They buddied me up with Jeff, who I got on very well with. And we ended up doing a show there, which was a lot of fun, Jeff was good, was a good laugh. I remember when we were doing some filming there, we were on top of the mountain, it was 10,000 feet, and the Chinese had given us this little tent. And we're both 6 foot and over, both big guys, and it was not designed for guys our size. And I had to say at one point, Jeff, your moustache is brushing my cheek. So it was not. It was not, and we had a lot of fun there. I mean, having to work a thermal imaging camera with no instructions, and the instructions rather are only in Mandarin Chinese was quite interesting. That was a challenge, especially 10,000 feet up, trying to work it. But I managed it. And at the end of that, one of the things I thought was very cool. At the end of that, Jeff did a paper, a sort of memorandum draft. A joint collaboration, I think, was one of the first of its kind, if not the first, with Dr. Zhou from the Beijing Museum of Natural History, talking about the footprint anatomy of a cast that was provided by a tracker there called Mr. Yuan, arguing the similarities between the Yeren and the North American Bigfoot, Sasquatch, or whatever you want to call it, which was a really nice little piece of science. So I think Monster Quest should have made more of that. It was a big find, and they should have built it up a lot more than they did on the show. I thought that was really significant and became a really significant piece of science. It was a really good find, and I liked it. So people sometimes say, these shows never produce anything. Well, that clearly did. It produced a really significant scientific collaboration. So I was very pleased that happened on that show, and it was a lot of fun to make. I had a really good time. There's many stories I could tell you, Mike, but it was a really good laugh, that show. Good fun.
Good stuff. Yeah, we actually had a question from the chat room. And I will apply this to both the Yeti and the Yeren. Adam, do these cultures, do the locals see these animals more as flesh and blood creatures or spiritual beings or a little bit of both? Or how are they viewed by the indigenous population?
Good question, whoever that asked me that. Mainly flesh and blood, really. They don't take on any specific spiritual properties. So let's be specific, because I like being specific with my legal law head on. The Yeti is often it was described as having benefits in certain potions that the shamans would use it for, but it was described the meat and the bones of the Yeti were used in them, which suggests a physical animal. Do you see what I mean? So it doesn't suggest it's not regarded as being some spectre that appears and disappears. It's regarded as a real creature. If I go to Mongolia and I talk to the eyewitnesses there, they describe a real creature. They're kind of freaked out by it, but it's a real creature. If you go back to the Orang-Pendek and you look at the texts allegedly purporting to come from Marco Polo in 1292, again, they describe this hairy little man who lives in the forest and makes a sort of strange clicking language. But it's a creature. It's not a spirit. It's a creature. They do regard, some of them will regard it as having, some of the Sumatrans regarded the Orang-Pendek as being the king of the forest, so being the head of all the animals above even the tiger. But I never really found in any of my research any particular spiritual dimension to any of these hominids that struck me. Funnily enough, it's only in the North American Bigfoot culture where you get this spirit stuff from modern day Americans. Not all of them, obviously, just some. But and that interested me from a sort of an anthropological point of view, because I never saw it anywhere. Even if I think, and it's not connected with man beasts, even with the pygmies, to the pygmies, the Makili Mamembe, the Congo dinosaur, and they were some of the most very respectfully primitive people I came across. They walked barefoot through the jungle, still had spears, and wore grass skirts. It was a tangible physical creature to them. They had legends and stories about it, but it was never a spirit. It was never described as just being a spirit. I understand that some Native American legends describe Bigfoot, Sasquatch as having spiritual properties, but many of them don't. Many of them describe it as having just a physical quality. But it's really only when you get towards North America, to the best of my knowledge, well, in fact, to all of my knowledge, that I ever came across it being a spirit, this notion that these creatures were in any way spiritual. They were magnificent or inspiring, but not ghosts or something else. Yeah?
Very, very good answer, actually. You put it in perspective very well. Regarding the Yeren, Adam, as far as its typical description, we're talking about, again, an upright, mostly probably bipedal hominid. Is that correct?
Yeah. One of the things I was interested in is what its ancestry could be. Because, of course, you have, potential Gigantopithecus around there. But the description of the Yeren is, again, it's 6 foot, and it's not particularly muscular built. So the Yeti is its physiology is greater than ours. The Yeren's doesn't seem to be that much greater. When I listen to the eyewitnesses describe it, it seems they described something more like a bipedal orangutan, which of course was around in those parts many centuries ago, many thousands of years ago, rather than something like as massive as a Gigantopithecus. It sounds more like that to me. I mean, Jeff in his paper looked at the similarities between, as I said, the foot structure between that and the North American Bigfoot, and said that they were very similar. But obviously we don't know exactly what it is because we haven't got or even localize what it is because we haven't got any DNA or a body. But I would suggest it's something. It's obviously a hominid and it's basic. I mean, it doesn't have any tool use that's any greater than, say, a chimpanzee's or anything. And that's where we are with it. I think that's as far as we can go right now, Mike. I mean, a very interesting creature. Probably on a par, I would say, same sort of intellect as, say, a chimp.
And the alleged range of the Yeren, the territory is mostly quite adverse and difficult to negotiate in many circumstances. Is that correct?
Yeah, they've got these. They've got these small mountains. It's in Hebei, Central Province, and they have these small mountains. It's one after another. It's very dense forest. Many, many hundreds and thousands of miles. Yeah, there's plenty of space for it to wander around, and if it's rare. And of course, we have some very significant evidence. So yeah, it could easily still be there in small numbers in that pocket of central China, as it has been in all probability since we came along.
For millennia,
all of these,
no doubt.
I would imagine that all of the numbers of these things are probably declining with the encroachment of man, because one thing that we're exceptionally good at is breeding, and there's more and more of us all the time, and probably less and less of them as a consequence. But there isn't really a solution to that, except extensive conservation and a bit of luck and hope.
Yes, some crossed fingers, no doubt. Well, Adam,
Thanks.
You've also been to Mongolia and other places, and one of the man beasts that certainly piques my interest, because it seems to be a little bit different than some of the others, is the almasty, or alma. Can you speak to us a little bit about the almasty? Is it true that many reports would describe it as almost like a Neanderthal type entity or a person?
Well, there was some speculation that it might be a Neanderthal, and I did a couple of expeditions to Mongolia, and I explored the western side of Mongolia near Kazakhstan, looking for evidence of it, and there was speculation it could be like Neanderthal man. Now let's set the scene about what Neanderthal man is. He isn't this primitive, ignorant, almost stupid creature that was originally portrayed by the Victorians. They got their understanding and their skeletal construction of the Neanderthal man completely wrong. He certainly would have been like us, and probably on a good day would pass in a crowd for us, yeah? They were stronger than us, we think, and their noses were broader because they had to deal with more cold, because it was very cold in Europe where they're from at the time, yeah? So I'm just focusing on Europe, and maybe they got over to Mongolia, but they had, what we now know is they probably had a language. Their skeletal structure, their rib cage and their physiology would suggest that they talked in a higher voice, interestingly. Yeah, so more like that than we do, more like that. Yeah, they had a higher voice. Now they also had a language, as I said. They had music. They did painting. We think they mourned their dead. We think they loved as well as lived. So they were an advanced culture. Now, that's important for me to state as a starting point. Now, when I went to Mongolia and I spoke to eyewitnesses of the almas, whatever you want to call it, they described a bipedal hominid covered in hair. And in some cases, when it ran away on four legs, almost like an ape might run.
Like an ape,
not a Neanderthal man. It was not a Neanderthal man. Forgive me, there was no evidence of tool use or anything else like that. So, do I think the Mongolian almasty in Russia is a Neanderthal? No, I don't. I don't think it is at all. I think and one of the other things is, again, if you examine the historical records, what I could see when I went from the sort of southern western side of Mongolia all the way up is I could see a creature that was declining in knowledge and had existed. So, for example, I went to this place in the south which was described as the Mountain of the Almas, and they'd never heard of the Almas. It's only as I got nearer and nearer and nearer to a small place around a town called Hovd in this Pacific mountain range that I started to pick up any witnesses or any evidence. And that showed how it had, I would suggest, and this is a theory, of course, how it had once been more widespread across Mongolia, and it had declined, so it was in a shorter mountain range, a shorter area.
Well, that's fascinating. There again, it's a situation where the population might seem to be on the decline, and that's an unfortunate situation. There again, I think, it's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of misrepresentation when it comes to the honesty as far as when you get into people's interpretation. And that's why it's so good to have somebody that has firsthand experience like yourself available on the show, because there's nothing like being there in person. And it's very odd that you would have, this mountain range named after these hairy men, and nobody really knows that. I mean, like, oh, we don't know about that, or that's strange. But I guess in time things do change, and regrettably, it looks like that may be the case where the honesty could be severely declining in numbers. Whereas you may have had a healthy, vigorous population base at one point, that may no longer be the case at all.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I did think when I was there, again, I have to qualify it by saying it's speculation, but I did think, well, it could well be on the edge or even past the brink of extinction, certainly in that particular case, yeah.
Well, that's certainly not good news from any perspective, but it is a reality we're faced with. And, there's been some interesting reports on the honesty, and we don't have time to go into a lot of great detail, but obviously some of the things you touched on were a description of a Neanderthal having the flat, broad nose and a pronounced brow ridge, and some of those things just kind of seem to have came into play because of some of the accounts. But that's not necessarily the case at all. As you just referred, there are even instances where this creature has been reported to run on four legs, quadrupedally, if you will. That's very much an ape thing in my mind as an untrained person.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what struck me. And again, when we go back, when we're analysing what these particular creatures' cultural advancement is, one of the first things I look for is any potential sign of tool use. And there's no real tool use, again, other than like picking up rocks and using them to bash things with. There's no evidence that I could see that it did anything more sophisticated than that. And if I look at the stories that were told by the locals and or the legends, when there were a number of different abduction stories, for example, but the stories they described was a very culturally primitive creature. Yeah.
Very. Well,
as you
also
contrasted with the Neanderthal, which was not, yeah? So there we are.
Yes, indeed. And in contrast to that, if you will, let's talk quickly about India and the Mande-Burung, if I'm saying that correctly. That's certainly an animal or a beast that's described quite differently than a Neanderthal, something of great mass, no doubt. And when you went to India, one of the things that really stuck out to me is the nature of the fact that the government there, even the forestry people, have not ventured out to survey much of the surrounding area that you were into. And at one point I read that they estimated they only had probably about 30% of that one area surveyed, and they really had no idea what was out there because of its great vastness. Talk to me about India.
Yeah, well, I was interested in the stories of India's having a creature called the Mande-Burung, as you described. Now, that part of India is in the Garo Hills, and the people there have an Asiatic appearance rather than the appearance of people from India that people are most familiar with. And it's on the border near Bangladesh, and this jungle when I was speaking to one of the officials there, because I was asking for permission to go to this area, because they'd had a lot of problems in that area with some terrorist activity. They'd had some separatists arguing about terrorist activity. So I had some problems. They'd had some problems. So I had to sort of report to a few officials, and they were always very nice to me, asking me what I was doing, etc. But the guy, when I spoke to the forestry people, because I had to get permissions and permits, it's very important you get these permits and you research what permits you need for anyone who's thinking of going on these trips, so you don't get into trouble. Do your homework and make sure you know what permits you have. So I went and spoke to this guy, and he basically said, as you've mentioned, we have no idea what really is in most of this forest. We've not traversed it. We've not necessarily got the resources to do so. I mean, people have been through parts of it, especially hunters, but that lots of it we don't know an awful lot about, and I thought that was particularly interesting. One of the other things I wanted to mention to you, because I thought that you would find it interesting, and some of our listeners may well do as well, was that they described the Mande-Burung as being a very large creature, unlike the Heron and the Almas that we talked about earlier on, and even the Yeti in Nepal. This is a big creature. They're talking about something that would be 7-8 foot tall and very muscular. And it did remind me much more of a potential Gigantopithecus type relic than any of the other things I ever looked for. It's difficult to know exactly what the Gigantopithecus looked like because of all of the things. I think it's important I make this point. People often think there are loads of skeletal remains for our ancestors and all these creatures that we're looking for, and where are all these skeletons? Well, we really don't have an awful lot of skeletal evidence for many of these creatures. Gigantopithecus, a few bones, a few teeth here, a jawbone there. We've got a finger bone for one of our ancient human ancestors. So people need to put that in context. But also, this physical description matches a very large primate. And I did think when I was there, Gigantopithecus, and I didn't think that anywhere else, anywhere in the world.
That's fascinating. And certainly, as you say, we don't really have a lot to go on when it comes to many of these species like Gigantopithecus. And I understand that most of the bones we have for that specimen would probably fit in the shoebox, for example, to put that in perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Not even that with a lot of them. Really, not even that.
Yeah. So little to work with, certainly, but a fascinating creature, and one we don't know a lot about, but certainly one that is in stark contrast perhaps to the others. And another creature in Asia that's even more of a contrast perhaps in the other direction is the diminutive Orang-Pendek. Now, I know you have been to Sumatra more than once, Adam, and you are certainly among the most qualified to speak on the matter. Tell me a little bit about my little Orang-Pendek buddies.
Mm-hmm. Well, more than once is a fair point. I think a lot. How many times have I been? I think I've done eight surveys, expeditions, whatever you might call them, to Sumatra, and I've made a few films there as well. Well, again, one of the reasons when I first went to Sumatra many years ago now, I did a survey of the whole island. I went up and down it looking for any evidence of it, because I was originally interested in those records. As I said, the ones that went back to Marco Polo at the time, that 1292, which talked about a short, hairy creature that lived in the woods that made a clicking noise. I was interested in all of those, and I wanted more evidence. But when I boiled it down or focused it down really to this area in Western Sumatra, where there was a concentration of sightings around an area, a place called Gunung Tuja, and I went to that area. I took a guide up there, and I went up to this area, and he described to me how he'd seen two of them having a fight. He'd seen two having a fight, over a piece of rattan, a young rattan, because sometimes they eat that. And he basically disturbed them, and they ran away. So he showed me the place where that had happened, and I found him to be quite credible. I was interested in what he had to say. Remember, I was a lawyer for 10 years, and I was used to cross-examining people. And at that stage, I was a lawyer and started doing it. A sort of a lawyer working for the British government. It's a long description of exactly what I was, but I worked for the Home Office anyway. And I was very interested in finding out more information. So I think Debbie Martyr and Jeremy Holden had spent a lot of time there, so I got in touch with them. I brought a team out. And there's a massively long story I could say, but basically we found a footprint cast and took that to be analysed, A, by Jeff Mildrum, who concluded it was unknown species, but also by Dr. David Chivers at Cambridge, and he concluded it was an unknown species. And then we took the hair from that to be analysed. At the time, there wasn't DNA evidence was not where it is now. I mean, the DNA analysis has transformed so much over the last, even the last couple of years. But the guy who analysed it, I went to see him in Australia afterwards, which is where he lived, was a guy called Dr. Hans Brunner. And Dr. Brunner had been used by the Australian police. There was a famous case, which was a film involving the actress Meryl Streep, the Lindy Chamberlain case. And in that, there was a dispute as to whether Lindy Chamberlain had killed her own baby or whether a dingo, a dog, had taken it. And she said a dingo had taken it. And the police, he was good enough, Hans Brunner, to be used in the murder trial for the Australian police, where the hair analysis was used to determine that a dingo had taken it. Now, Hans Brunner, of his own volition, did a lot of work on the hair sample that we found. He matched it and analysed it with all potential known indigenous species, and he came to the conclusion at the time that it was indeed from an unknown species of primate, which was fantastic. He did actually face some academic hostility at the time, but he overrode that. You know, he said, "Well, I'm doing this because I'm fascinated by scientific discovery." So he decided to do it. Did it all for free, and you know, I wrote about this, and people can Google this for free in Edge Science magazine. There's an article I wrote entitled "New Primate Species in Sumatra," and they can see the conclusions there, and they can see exactly what I'm talking about. You can Google it for free. Go to New Primate Species in Sumatra. You can see my article, and that was good enough for a murder trial. But the point I want to make about that, his evidence was good enough for a murder trial, obviously on a different matter. But you know, when I went on, when I talked to when I talked to Nature magazine, Henry G. He made this point, which we all make a lot. You know, if it's a new species of frog, then there's no problem with the evidence that we have. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. It's a classic mantra which we all quote when we're looking at this. And it's right, because of what we're talking about is so scientifically revolutionary, then it's really important to remember that because of that, then the evidence that we have to get, the bar of evidence is that much higher. And it's no good people being frustrated, thinking, you know, why isn't this being recognised? Well, it isn't going to be unless we have something really good. And in terms of really good, what I'd like to see, to take what you're really interested in now, and I'm moving the question forward a little, if I may, because I just want to make this point while it's in my head. In terms of evidence, what we really need in terms of evidence of any of these creatures is not a blurry picture, is not a bush with a red circle around it. Yeah. If you're going to take a picture, it needs to be a really good a really good photograph or a really good FLIR image that can be analysed, which shows movement, a really good one. So the photo or the FLIR image or whatever you want to do needs to be of a good quality. If we need a DNA sample as well in the future going forward, which is replicated and peer reviewed by other people who are of a commensurate level. It's that sort of thing that we're looking to take the story further with. Footprints are great and they're interesting, and I like hearing about them, but we need to make next steps. And what I do find is that people are often looking a bit backwards, thinking, what can we learn from the Patterson-Gimlin? And that's useful, but they need to look forwards, really, and focus on what evidence can we get, which is of a really high quality, which takes the story further. And so I try to focus myself on what I can do, what evidence I could gather which might take the story further, rather than overanalyze information which we've already historically been through.
I understand. And I follow you completely and agree. The court science is a tough sell. You have to have hard, tangible evidence. Stories are great. Yeah, you got to bring something strong. If you're going to say, there's an Orang-Pendek out there, then you need to show proof. And I think it's fascinating that you've actually been in the field and produced some tangible evidence. That's very compelling.
Yeah, and it's been good quality. It's been good quality, but you don't see me all butthurt because it's not accepted by the scientific establishment. What my job is to get more evidence of any creature I look for and hope that it is in the future and hope that I can move the story further. It should never be about ego and personality. It's always about the evidence. And what I always say to you when we talk is it doesn't matter what I think or you think. What matters is what evidence is produced, which is analysed. That's what matters. That's all that matters, ever. Yeah, the evidence, not the personality, not who we might like and dislike, not who's what so-and-so's theory is, certainly not what's on Facebook or any of the other social media. It's all about the evidence and how it can be analysed. And that's all that matters ever. And with the Orang-Pendek, I'd love it. I'm very clear about my own bias. I like my evidence to be analysed objectively, but I believe it exists, and I'd love it to be proven to exist. I worry terribly that it's going to end up not existing because of the massive encroachment on the rainforests in those areas. I'm worried its habitat's going to go, and we're going to lose something which is scientifically fascinating and exciting. And that's my driver. That, and the second driver is I have an intellectual drive to understand just what these creatures might be and where we go with them, what can we learn from them. I have a fascination about them, which has led me to be passionate. But it's very important that we do it, we get that evidence in the right way, and we don't do anything negative, arguing. I'm not interested in any of that. All I'm interested in is getting that evidence, because that's what will take us all further. And ultimately, we all want the same thing, those of us who are interested in gathering scientific evidence. If you want a spiritual relationship with something, then I'm not your man. You're really not. Yeah. But if you're looking for the gathering of evidence, then I hope I am your man, and I'll do my best for you. With whatever resources I've got, until I can't do it anymore.
Well, I agree, Adam. You said that quite well. And I think that many of these man-beasts will certainly warrant further investigation, and certainly something we'll be talking to you about on many occasions, hopefully here in the near future. I really appreciate you coming in tonight and joining me, as you usually do. I appreciate the audience bearing with both of us, a little bit under the weather in both cases. But
yeah, a little bit. We're a little bit groggy today, eh? But we've survived. we
made it through. Yes, I did want to go ahead and mention we will be having a very special show with Cliff Brockman and yourself on Tuesday, May the 8th. So everybody will want to check the calendars for that show. We will bring Cliff and you in to talk specifically in more detail about Orang-Pendek.
Yeah, absolutely, and I look forward to that because what Cliff will be able to do, and I've deliberately not touched on it today because I've known that we're doing another show on it. I've sort of set the scene and talked about the history a lot today and stuff that he wasn't involved in. So when Cliff comes on the show and we talk about the Orang-Pendek, we can talk about, for example, the Finding Bigfoot show I did with him on the Orang-Pendek, and then we can talk about the Orang-Pendek project and what that meant. I can do that as well, and we'll have plenty to talk to him about as well. So that'll be a good show coming up. And before then we've got other shows to come, not least next week probably.
Absolutely, and I hope that everyone will tune in on Tuesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific to join us when they can. And, of course, all of our episodes are available on demand at blogtalkradio.com/ICRA. Anytime you're on the road or just got time to squeeze a show in there somewhere while you're cooking dinner or something, why don't you check us out? And Adam, where can we find your book, your very fine book, Man Beast, A Personal Investigation by Adam Davies?
Well, that's on Amazon. Anyone can find that, and they can also find my first book, Extreme Expeditions, Travel Adventures, Stalking the World's Mystery Animals. Both of those are on Amazon, and people can feel free to get them. And also, I imagine next year I'll probably have another book out, and that book will focus on Bigfoot. I think most particularly Bigfoot in America. So that's coming up. That's coming up next year, I hope, if I finish it.
Well, that is fantastic news. I'm very anxious to see what that's going to be all about.
Mm-hmm. Well, you'll be in it. So I would imagine you will.
Well, that's even better news. I'm be compelled to maybe even buy a copy.
Good stuff, Mike.
Well, Adam, I'm afraid we're running short on time, my friend. Thank you so much, and that's such a wonderful show. I could talk to you all night about this, obviously, but time constraints will forbid it.
Yeah, we've touched on, I think, 3 or 4 of them, and we haven't got time to do the rest, but we've got plenty of other time. We'll talk again, don't worry.
Absolutely. And again, join us on May the 8th, Tuesday at 9 p.m. for Cliff and Adam on Orang-Pendek. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everyone in the chat room. Everyone.
Thanks, Mike.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Everyone have a great night, and good night.
Good night.